we'll get started. I will turn it over to Victoria first, kind of introduce this session and this work broadly for the foundation, and then Sarah and I will walk through some preliminary results after that.
Fantastic. Thanks, Piyush. So for those of you whom I haven't met, I'm Victoria Vrana. I'm a Deputy Director at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and I oversee our work on everyday donors and on the giving ecosystem, so policy and data. But the foundation, our team is also beginning to explore kind of high capacity donors and what makes them tick. What tools and services do they need to give more, to give better, to give to reduce inequities? And we're taking on a couple different things in that space to learn more. And so we partnered with Ideas 42. I want to say earlier this year, but like time is so weird since the pandemic. I think it was actually last year at some point in the blur of the decade that was last year. To start a learning exploration and agenda that Piyush will tell you more about. And they've actually started learning and they've started collecting data. And we're going to get some early results today, which is super cool. And so this is part of an ongoing exploration for us that, again, includes research, and it also includes a kind of deeper look at how digital products can help high net worth donors. This is a space that we see a lot of interest and activity in, but a lot of questions. I don't think we have the answers on how high net worth donors will or will not use digital tools to support their giving. And so in addition to the learning agenda, we'll be supporting some piloting where we're helping existing donor communities use a digital platform, CapShift to be specific, and to really just test out what works and what doesn't, for whom, how, when, which giving decisions, all these kinds of things. So it'll be a 2-year journey. And this is really kind of the beginning of us sharing what we're learning along this journey, because as much as we want success for these 6 donor communities and we're interested in the CapShift platform, this isn't really about either of those things. It's about the whole field and what we can learn and share with everyone as we go along. So with that, I'm going to do, let's see, Piyush, are you going to do the guideline chat intro, all that kind of stuff?
Yes, I can do that.
Well, then I will just turn it all over to you then.
All right. Thank you, Victoria. And thank you, as always, for the support and to do all this interesting work. So I'm Piyush Tantia. I'm Chief Innovation Officer at Ideas 42. I think I've probably met all of you or most of you in the room, since so many of you were kind enough to let us interview you, and some of you multiple times as well. And then my colleague, Sarah Welch, is here as well. She's a vice president at Ideas 42. And when she jumps on, she can do a little introduction. But in the meantime, just a couple of housekeeping things. So currently the session is being recorded. When we get to the discussion portion, we will switch off the recording just so we can have a very frank discussion, because we really want your feedback. These are very preliminary results rather than anything final or any definitive design solutions or anything like that. This is just what we've heard from many of you so far, and we've kind of put it through a behavioral lens, and we're playing it back, and we'd love your feedback. There are the community guidelines around the conference, which hopefully you've seen, but basically they're just around respectful discussion, be open, please share, jump in to the chat. So since we have 40 participants here, we won't do a live real-time introduction for everyone, but perhaps you could just, if you would like, type in a quick introduction into the chat so everyone can see where you're calling in from, and maybe if you want to say something about your role in the philanthropy space or the organization you're in, whatever you feel is interesting to share, or maybe a fun hobby that you've been enjoying during the pandemic. Just something so we get to know each other a little bit. In the meantime, I will start jumping through the presentation. If you do have questions along the way, please just type them into the chat. We will pause and try to address them as they come up. As we want this to be as interactive as possible. Okay. Sarah, do you want to quickly introduce yourself before I jump in?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Welch. I'm a VP at Ideas 42, and I wear two hats there. I spent a lot of time leading our giving work and working with Piyush on this and other work focused on everyday donors. And then I also helping build our climate portfolio and work in that space as well. And hi to everyone that I think I've talked to many people on this call already. So thank you again, echoing Piyush, for your time. Turn it back to you, Piyush.
Thanks, Sarah. All right, so as I mentioned, these are preliminary results from some of this work. And just to recap for you what this is coming from, what did we do over the last few months, is we've been exploring the experiences of both donors as well as professionals who support those donors, operate donor communities, etc. Real range of folks who work in this space. So roughly to date, and these numbers may already be outdated because we've been doing so many interviews, we've interviewed about 30 donors, about 20 or so philanthropy professionals of different roles, ranging from individual philanthropy advisors to community foundation executives, experts, etc. We've also reviewed existing research out there from academics, Stanford PACS, and other places that study this space quite a lot. So what we'll present today is kind of an encapsulation of findings to date, which are we find broadly 5 potential barriers from a behavioral science perspective. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Like, what do I mean by a barrier from a behavioral science perspective? Right, so just a quick introduction to what behavioral science is and how we work. This is a great photo that kind of shows that, right? So it's funny that these two guys are on their way to work out, but they choose to take the escalator. Now, yeah, it's interesting and funny that they're choosing to take the escalator, but what's more interesting to us as behavioral designers is, why did someone put an escalator there in the first place? Right? It's not really ADA helpful. An elevator would be needed for that. So why put an escalator leading up to a gym? And okay, maybe this building wasn't a gym before, or there may be some such reason. But the point is that when we understand people's behavior and psychology, we might design things differently. So if we had known people's psychology, that we tend to just take the path of least resistance. We tend to go for what's right in front of us. Someone may have said, well, maybe it would be healthier to not put an escalator there. Right. So this is what we do at Ideas 42 across a range of areas, in this case, charitable giving. We think about how design elements out in the world are affecting people's behavior, but also how things going on within people is affecting their behavior. And then we look for things that are barriers that make life difficult for us. They might make it hard for us to choose, hard for us to follow through on our intentions. And we look to redesign those to get rid of those barriers. Okay. So just, we'll end up using some jargon because we're so accustomed to it. So just to get you all caught up on that, right, we talk a lot about the context. And by the context, we mean lots of different things. It could be what other people are doing, the physical environment, the way a choice was presented, information you're looking at, et cetera, whether you're tired or hungry, all of those things. So those contextual features interact with our psychologies. And the most important point here is they interact most of the time completely unconsciously. So we have no idea these things are affecting us most of the time, okay? And then that's what leads to behavior. So when we look at people's behavior, actually a lot of it is just being driven unconsciously by all these little things that we ignore when we design things because it's unintuitive. Okay. So here are some examples of context, right? Time, social context are very influenced by that, what other people are doing. Scarcity is an important one. So in all of our work with lower income populations, the scarcity of money is very, very costly because they're constantly having to make trade-off decisions. And that chews up so much processing power in your brain, it's equivalent to losing a night of sleep. That's what the research shows. All of us on this call probably suffer from time scarcity, and we're equally making tough trade-offs of time, and that takes up a lot of bandwidth. So there are some of these things that are internal to us, some of these things are external to us. Okay. So through the research and interviews that we were doing, we try to figure out what are these contextual features at play, right? And then how are they interacting with psychologies to affect behavior? So when we talk to many of you, this is what we were internally doing. We were trying to understand your experience, right? What did you do? What information were you looking at? Who were you talking to? What was difficult? What was easy? And those are the questions that we were asking you. We were relating those to psychologies and behaviors. And ultimately what we're trying to do is, what is troublesome here? Right? What are the troublesome contextual features in psychologies? Things that make it hard for donors, for philanthropy professionals to do what they're trying to do. So that is what we're presenting here. So it's findings from interviews, but we've put them through this lens and generated hypotheses for what could be troublesome, what are possible sort of barriers. Okay. So there are 5 that we're going to walk through. After each one, we're going to launch a quick poll to just get your gut check on does this barrier resonate or not. So even now we're collecting data from you. So thank you very much in advance. And then at the end, we'll have more of a discussion of, did we miss something? Which of these barriers seem to be most important? So as you're listening, also think about it, this doesn't seem quite right, or maybe it's a little different, or they're missing something. So please do keep those things in mind. All right. So the first one we want to talk about is that the giving system as a whole, so the whole experience of interacting with all of the organizations, tools, the charities, ways of giving out there, from a behavioral perspective, we think can be paralyzing. Few things drive this. One is just the overwhelming number of choices out there. So there are a lot of different causes, social issues that you could be supporting. There are a lot of charities you could be supporting. If you want to access an educational program on philanthropy, there's lots and lots of those out there. So there's just a lot of choice. And we know from a lot of behavioral research that while people always want more choice, too much choice can be very paralyzing and people make no choice. Another thing we heard very consistently from donors is they really want to learn more. They really want to make good choices and be careful, but yet many don't have the time to delve into it and to learn a lot. And there's, as I said, a lot of choices of ways to learn also. So this is a classic behavioral issue where you say, well, next month I'll have more time, I'll dig into it then. Right now I don't have time. Right. And a great example of this, I was reflecting for myself, is voting in local elections. Right. I often procrastinate this until the last minute, and at times I've not voted because I decided, but I didn't really learn enough about the candidates and the issues. Right. So I shouldn't really go and vote because it's irresponsible. And it's that same sort of feeling. And then the last very important feature here for giving is there's really no deadline or requirement. So when there's no deadline, when you have a lifetime and possibly beyond your lifetime to do your giving, there's no urgency to go through this very difficult process of choosing and learning and so on, right? So that's the first set of barriers. And just to contextualize this, we'll show you some of the psychology studies. So the famous study around this was done at one of those fancy grocery stores around the Stanford campus. The researchers set up 2 tasting stations in different weeks at the same store. So in one case, they had 24 varieties of jam available to taste. In another case, they had 6 varieties of jam. And the outcome they were looking at is, what happens? How many people stop to taste? And then how many actually buy jam at the end? So that was the main outcome. So as you would expect, a lot more people stop at that attractive display of 24 jams. But the purchases are almost 10 times lower when there are 24 jams. What's happening here is the researchers also had stationed people to watch what people were doing when they were standing outside in front of the jam display, trying to pick. When they had tasted amongst 24 varieties, they would stand there, struggle, try to choose, and then ultimately just walk away after a few minutes. When people had chosen just 6 from among 6, they would walk up to the display, pick up the jam, and walk out. Easy, done. So choice is paralyzing. And one of the reasons why choice is paralyzing is because we really hate to make a choice that we will later regret. This is perhaps extra powerful in the giving case. Right? You really don't want to find out later that, oh, that money I gave got wasted, quote unquote. It didn't get used for what I thought, or there was some scandal, or maybe I could have done something more strategic, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a study that's just showing how long it takes people to make a decision. And this is a hypothetical decision about investments. And what the researchers vary is that in the control condition, you only get to sort of see what happens to the funds that you chose. In the regret condition, you get to see the performance of all of the funds that were available for you to choose. Right. So if you can see that some other fund did better than the one you chose, then you know that you'll regret your choice. So they created the scenario where people could regret their choice, and when they do that, people take much longer to choose, and then they also view more information about the funds in trying to choose. All right, so this is what's happening in the giving case as well, we think. Right. All right, so that was the first one. So the giving context in general is quite paralyzing because of the choice and the need to learn first. So here we're going to launch this poll. Scale of 1 to 4. 4 is this strongly resonates with you. 1 is it doesn't really resonate too much. Okay. So please go ahead and launch the poll.
Is it okay to chime in while we're completing the poll?
Sure.
Do you think that it matters where people are in their evolution as givers? In other words, if somebody is just starting out and has just signed the giving pledge, how differently does this framework apply than it might to someone who has been running their family office or their family foundation for a decade or more?
Yeah.
Is there an evolution or a way of bucketing people a little bit?
No, that's a great comment. And yes, people do eventually figure this out, right? So yeah, people who are further along in their journey, we usually heard that they found a good advisor, they found a resource, they started to just take a lot of time to do the research themselves because they stopped working or their kids graduated or left home, various things that gave them more flexibility to themselves start digging in more. So yeah, that does happen. Eventually people do figure it out. So this is more of an issue early on. But what we don't know is, how many people never figure it out or are just sitting there with a lot of capacity and intention to give and are still paralyzed. And that is what we're trying to solve for, is activating all of those folks.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So, and
there's a question in the chat if about from Joe McCannon.
let me go ahead and we have 83. Oh, people are still voting. Okay, I'll leave this on. Let's see. Has your research suggested any difference in investor behavior if they know that all the potential recipients of funds they're choosing between will receive some guaranteed proportion of the total available pot? That is an interesting design.
I mean, I could offer, it sounds a little bit similar to some of the
Give list
designs, within Give List, which was a different audience, but the idea was, let's present a set of curated charities. And there were a couple of designs. Sometimes you could just choose one, and there were some designs where there was like a donate to all button. And that, I think that was a promising direction to go in. I don't know that we have anything, we haven't done it yet with like a larger place. I think the tension would be at certain point, like the diminishing returns of diluting all of your impact across many different charities. So I think that's like the tension there is, it can be a really good solution to have like a donate to all type of button. But the flip side might be that it starts to kind of spread out the feeling of impact across too many different charities.
This is Joe. I entered in the question. I just quickly share that as a data point. I helped manage a large giving circle of about 1,200 people, and in that giving circle, we had a lot of complaints and a lot of angst about people saying they felt bad choosing between all these great organizations. And when we made a new stipulation that every single organization that applied for funds from us would get some guaranteed minimum amount, we noticed that we never heard that complaint again. We never heard that worry again in our comments. And so I'm just looking if there's like any confirmation of that elsewhere. It's totally, a 1x. It's a small case, but for me it was an insight, and I think it also it aligns in important ways with equity. If we realize that the applying organizations have different level of resources to apply and maybe different familiarity with application processes, that also made people feel a bit better.
Yeah, no, 100% agree with both of those. And as Sarah mentioned, we also do have evidence from at least one small lab study that it does help to at least give people the option to just donate to all. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but yeah, people really, really hate saying no to charities. It's very difficult in general for us to say no to anything. And to charity, it's so strong that people tend to even avoid the ask actively. So that's another factor playing into this.
Yeah, I guess what I'm really interested in is, does it also make it easier for them to say yes if they don't have to say no? And that's the thing I can't quite figure out, but it would be interesting to learn more about that at some point.
Sure. Well, let me jump forward here so we don't run too behind, but thank you so much for all the questions and comments. Please keep them coming. Okay, so the next one, this is very much a hypothesis, right? So what we heard from everyone, and this confirmed previous research as well, this is not going to be surprising to anyone, is that a lot of giving in the high net worth space especially is very relationship based, whether it be a relationship with an advisor who then curates giving options, relationships between donors and charities, between advisors and charities, et cetera. It's all very kind of personal, and that kind of makes sense. right? It is an emotional act from a psychological perspective. But the risk that could exist based on general research around unconscious bias is that this opens up the door for unconscious bias where somebody asking or a charity leader, et cetera, is different from you somehow. That can make a difference. Unconscious stereotypes, et cetera, and judgments of competence and so on that can play into the decision without anyone realizing it. And that's what's really bad about some of the science is it's completely unconscious and implicit to us and very, very difficult to correct for. Actually, you cannot the researchers find that you cannot train people out of this. It's very difficult. And then more practically speaking, there may be effective charities out there who are just not connected into the network, or they don't have the resources to connect into the network and they could get left out. And then there's also duplication of effort on the side of the professionals. Right? So many professionals, even donors themselves, are often doing research on similar issues, and unless you manage to network your way to others working in the same space, it's actually quite hard to access all of the research that's been done out there in one place. So this, we think, is a possible sort of barrier as well. So some of the underlying psychology around this, this is an interesting study that compares emotion versus data in giving asks, right? So in one case, people get something like this, where it's a photo, it's details about the specific child and her life, and so on. In the other case, there's a bunch of data. Right. So you would think that telling people that there are millions of children suffering from food insecurity ought to prompt them to give more, right? As opposed to telling them about one child who's suffering from food insecurity. And so this is what the researchers compare. And let's see what happens. So here's the individual. This is the giving amount. Now, what's most interesting about this is, okay, emotion, the single story, you all know this, you've been in philanthropy for a long time, that tends to prompt people to give more than just the data. But what happens when you put the data and the emotional appeal together is the data actually reduces the giving, right? So this is where we're doing something emotional, but then thinking about numbers and data is kind of kicking us out of that emotional mode and back into a deliberative mode. And then we might start to get, worried, like, oh, is this the best thing? I should research it more. I don't understand this jargon, et cetera, et cetera. You could go down that sort of paralysis route. Another side of this is we really tend to like people who are similar to us. And this is very, very extreme. So even if the similarity is incidental, it has an effect. So in this study, the experimenter poses as a fundraiser. So subjects are brought in to do an experiment about something that's a decoy. And then just incidentally, the experimenter shows up and says, hey, while you're here, would you like to donate to XYZ cause? And they're wearing a name tag, and they pretend to have the same name as the subject. Okay, and when they have the same name, these subjects will donate twice as much. Shouldn't make a difference, but it does. There's lots of other research that links similarity to liking, and that is probably the mechanism here, that if you like someone, you will tend to support them, you'll tend to think they're more competent, etc. All of this is happening unconsciously. Right, so these are just a couple of the studies. There's this data is not all, perfect, but there's a lot of room for this type of bias to creep in when the whole space is so driven by personal relationships. All right, so same drill again, poll 1 to 4. 4 means you resonate strongly with this potential barrier. And please, if you don't agree or this is not resonating, please tell us, because this is very, very useful information for us.
Yeah, keep the comments and questions coming in the chat. It's really helpful. Really interesting.
Very impressed that Vicky knows the Dunning-Kruger effect, but Vicky's also been partnering with us for quite a long time.
I was going to say, that's probably more thanks to you guys than necessarily my
I'm
own.
glad we've turned you into a behavioral science nerd, Vicky. This is great. Okay, let's see. We'll wait for a couple more votes. All right, I think it seems stable. Let's share the results here. So also resonating, but slightly, ever so slightly less than the last one. Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. Stop sharing. Great. Well, Sarah, I will turn it over to you. So let me stop sharing so you can hop in.
Great. Thanks, Piyush. All right, so I'll share our third preliminary barrier, which centers on how donors are or are not able to connect and relate to donors like themselves and why that's so important. So in our research, what we heard a lot was that donors really value peer connection, but it's really hard to find. So on the one hand, we heard that from many folks that recommendations from those that they viewed as peers about where to go was really valuable, even more so valuable sometimes than advisors or so professionals in the space. But on the other hand, broaching those types of conversations can be really hard because of the sort of implied links of giving to wealth, and also because giving is seen as so personal. And so finding real peer connections who are mutually aligned on philanthropy can actually be quite challenging. And so where does that occur? In the pre-COVID world, it largely happened through in-person events and personal introductions through donor communities, so kind of serendipitous. And even for people who are philanthropy professionals, finding those strategic connections remains really labor intensive and manual. And so, here we go. So the need for this peer conversation and peer connection goes beyond the actual exchanging of information. So this is the sort of behavioral insight behind this, right? We all find comfort in what we call social proof, especially when we're in an unfamiliar situation. And you can imagine that emerges a lot in philanthropy, especially if you're starting to learn about the space and get involved. So I'm going to show this rather entertaining clip from Candid Camera from the 60s. This is not quite an unfamiliar situation, but you can see from this how...
The gentleman in the elevator now is a Candid star. These folks who are entering, the man with the white shirt, the lady with the trench coat, and subsequently one other member of our staff will face the rear. And you'll see how this man in the trench coat tries to maintain his individuality, but little by little, he looks at his watch, but he's really making an excuse for turning just a little bit more to the wall. Now we'll try it once again. Here's the Candid subject. Here comes the Candid Camera staff, 3 of them at least. And this man has apparently been in groups before.
So, this is obviously different from giving, but you can imagine this similar sort of desire to kind of see what everybody else is kind of doing in the group and sort of pick up on the perceptions of what we think we're supposed to be doing. Again, can play a strong role in the situation where we're not quite sure what we should be doing. So there is some direct research of this happening in giving. So this is a little bit of a different scale. This is a free art gallery where researchers put a transparent donation box and varied the contents of the box. So, whoops, gave it away a little bit. But in different trials, the box was filled with $100 in coins, or in small bills, or in large bills, or no money at all. And then researchers tracked the contributions that visitors made to the gallery. And when we say some visitors, it was 20,000 people, so it was a pretty good study from that perspective. And they found that donation amounts tended to reflect the original contents of the box, right? So if you put a bunch of coins in, then you tended to get more smaller donations. Whereas if you put larger bills in, people tended to also give larger bills, but at smaller rates or fewer rates, right? So smaller number of contributions, but higher amount for each. So this research with this, I'll show you those results there. What this research suggests, right, is that people are estimating whether and how much others are giving in order to make their own giving decisions. And at higher levels of giving, it's not quite so different, not very different from that, right? So knowing that others have also given to an organization can help make donors feel more comfortable giving to that organization. And we saw that in conversations with donor communities. People wanted to know, where are people giving? What should I do with my money, right? So that can make you feel a little more comfortable with that. Donors may also get a sense of what the sort of the right amount is from seeing what others are publicly donating. And of course, there's a flip side to this, right? So organizations that might be less popular or newer may have trouble gaining donor attention because they are kind of outside of the norm, right? So that makes it a little bit harder to break through that. But overall, we consciously or subconsciously pick up on what people around us are doing and perceptions of what that behavior is when we are making our own decisions about where to give. So that's the third finding. Okay, so poll time again. So on a scale of 1 to 4, with 4 being most strongly, how much does this resonate with you? And I didn't realize I can't see the chat while I am presenting. So there are interesting things in there. You should feel free to shout them out.
Yeah, I've been responding to some of them in the chat itself.
Great.
But yeah, we can pick up on some of those soon.
All right. Great. Okay, it looks like most people have voted now. So all right, similar findings. All right. Wait, share results. There you go. You can all see that. Oops. Okay. All right. Let me keep moving here. Boy, I really need like 4 screens. Okay. All right. So our fourth finding is around how donors figure out how much to give. And we've heard pretty much across the board at all income levels that this is really hard. Setting a budget for giving, figuring out how much you really want to give, say, in any given year, can be really hard. And it's true, again, across income levels. What we heard from many donors is that they don't really set a budget, or if they do, it's pretty arbitrary. And while that's not necessarily a problem in and of itself, what we also heard, though, right, is that donors often felt like they might have more to give, or they wanted to just do more. And it's much easier to figure out, right, how much you can give to one organization versus another when you know what your target is. And finally, more generally in the behavioral research, right, setting a goal we know can help us achieve what we're aiming for. And so, why is this hard to set a budget in philanthropy? It's really interesting. It's actually kind of a weird question. In some ways, you can think about it as trying to decide how much of your wealth is extra. And that's a really complicated thing to do. there aren't a lot of guidelines. Again, this goes back to the previous insight where it's hard to know what your peers are doing. There's not a lot of good benchmarks. And there's also an interesting and really powerful behavioral phenomenon that happens where we unconsciously anchor on totally unrelated numbers when we're trying to estimate something unknown. And so in this case, for some folks, great wealth can actually create kind of higher and higher anchors for what you think you need, making the decision even harder to figure out what amount of money is truly, extra and could go to philanthropy in the short term. So I'm going to illustrate this by running an experiment on you. So here goes. We're going to have you take the last 3 digits of your phone number just in your head. Okay. And now you're going to add a 1 to the front of that number so that now you have a 4-digit number and you can think of it as a year. Okay, everybody hopefully has that number in their head. So now I'm going to ask you, do you think that the Taj Mahal was completed before or after that year that you now have in your head? And then the real test. What is your best estimate for when the Taj Mahal was actually completed? Now I'm going to try to keep you honest here. Type your answer for that question in the chat. And I know you're all thinking about like social proof and what everybody else is doing, but it's fine. Try to override that. You are experiencing that too. Here we go. I see the numbers coming in. I'll give you all a little bit of time here.
Okay, now we have the years coming in. Yeah, that's what we want. Okay, interesting.
Yeah, there we go. Those are good guesses, everybody. Okay. All right. They're still coming. Thanks everyone for playing. This is great. All right, so the correct answer is 1648 for the Taj Mahal. Now, research suggests that the answer that you put in there was likely influenced by your phone number. Obviously, I can't go in and really validate this for everybody, but I'll let you reflect a little bit on whether that was your experience. And here's another version of that study. Okay, so in another version of the study, subjects were given a random number of either 10% or 65% randomly. And then after that, they were asked to estimate what percent of countries in the UN are African. And we saw, or what they saw is that if subjects got the 10% number, they guessed 25%. And if they got the 65% number, then they guessed 45%. So, I mean, this is a real phenomenon that you can sort of document the quantifiable effects of, which is pretty interesting. But then tying this back to giving, here's a really interesting example of anchoring. So in this research, wealthy participants from wealthy households were asked how much wealth was needed for full financial security. And they asked them at different levels of wealth, and then they kind of collected their answers. And what they saw is that there's this funny thing that happens where the wealth that you need is always a little bit out of reach. So you can see the folks at 5 to 20 million, that range, they think they need about 47% more. But when you get to that level, then you kind of feel like, well, maybe I need 22% more. And even when you're above the 50 million level, it still feels like you need a little bit more, a little 1% more. And so, in a context like giving, where you are, again, trying to figure out how much of your wealth is extra, it can be really hard to calculate that, given that you can't, trying to figure out where full financial security is, or that in of itself is sort of the subjective number that might be shifting. Okay. All right, so once again, we've got our poll. We can launch that poll, and so on a scale of 1 to 4, how strongly does this resonate? I do wish you could all see the numbers coming in. It's really fun to see. Although then if you saw them, you would be influenced by them. All right, I'm going to end the poll, share the results. And so again, I think a little more disagreement this time, which is interesting to hear more about. Maybe someone's cracked the code in terms of figuring out how much to give. Oh, wait, can you see it? Oh, there you go. Sorry, everyone. Now you can see it. A little more variation.
I was
All
just going to explain why I put a 1.
Yes, please.
Only because I think that sometimes there is a reference point for a lot of donors, and it's driven by tax policy and write-offs. It's not necessarily the reference point maybe that we would all, oftentimes they're in conversations with advisors who are talking about a benchmark, but it's not necessarily their peers.
Right. Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and that is definitely something that you need to consider in the interplay of philanthropy and making decisions about wealth. Thank you. Oh, Nick, I see your hand is raised.
Sarah, I also thought there's almost 2 steps to this too, right? There's the initial decision of how much you're going to give away. And then once that decision is made, which I think is made on quite arbitrary terms, then I think it's actually quite fixed. And that's a really interesting paradigm, right? Which is particularly in private foundation structures, if I've put 100 million in here, which may or may not be an arbitrary number, but probably somewhat arbitrary, once it's in there, then I'm pretty set on the distribution amount year over year, and I'm pretty challenged to think about fluctuating on that. And so it's like once an initial decision has been made, then you kind of stick to that decision. And the challenge that I've seen is, how do we get people to revisit that decision that was quite arbitrary in the first place, right? And that's really interesting. And the other comment that I had, or question, was, who are we solving for here? Because I think when you're talking about more of the everyday giver, this becomes very true that these decisions are a bit more fluid. But I think when you're talking about giving at scale and very large, significant gifts, then there tends to be some more planning involved in that. And I don't know if we're talking across the wealth spectrum or if this is more everyday giver.
I think this is across the wealth spectrum, and I think it really speaks to people. It goes back to some earlier comments or questions about like where people are in the giving journey or the philanthropy journey and how they're thinking about their giving. I think that there are certainly a lot of folks who have moved into a more strategic space. Maybe they've set up a DAF, and so they have this like commitment to what they really, or a foundation. They have this like commitment to what they really need to give away. But then I do think there are a lot of folks, some of whom we talk to, right, who are still in the space where they're making significant gifts, but really still kind of doing it in kind of a surprisingly arbitrary way, I guess, given what, I don't know, I feel like that makes it sound more negative than I mean for it to sound. They're still being very generous, but it's like, it's much less planned than I would expect. I think there is a lot of variation though. And I do think you're right that I think your point about like setting it aside is kind of making that initial decision can be really, really helpful in one way, because it gets you going down that path, but then it does bring a bunch of other decisions to be made on top of it. Thanks. All right. I'll just check the chat. Yeah, lots of good comments in there. Okay, I'm going to keep moving here. Tithing is also really interesting. And the last thing I will say here is that we did talk to a few folks, and we've seen a little bit of this emerging, right, where it can be helpful to think about giving as a percentage, because that's a little more scalable. And there are folks who kind of can set a target based on that. The other thing, of course, your budget and your needs may vary a lot over any given year. And so something that's a little more flexible can be a solution. All right, keep moving here. Okay, so our fifth and final barrier, which is the one that Piyush was alluding to earlier, which is basically saying no is really hard. So we heard from donors, and we know in general, right, that saying no to people asking for money in general, or asking for time, right, can feel really emotionally painful. And in addition, the research shows that we tend to value the things that we have already, the things that we're familiar with. That's the status quo. And then the challenge, of course, though, is that in giving, where we might want to be kind of exploring and seeking out the need, responding to the needs of the moment and finding new ideas, it can be really hard to balance that. So how do you balance the long-term support of organizations that you know really well versus shifting your strategy towards the current needs? And the fear of being asked for money is real. I really like this. This is a very simple experiment that really shows that well. So here, this is a study that found a third of shoppers would go out of their way and use a different door if there was a person who appeared to be a solicitor standing at the door they would otherwise use. So that person didn't even need to be actually asking for money. They just had to, I don't know, wear a t-shirt or look and smile and wave enough that folks were deterred. And so, you know, this kind of makes sense intuitively, right? But the problem with this is that you could imagine it would actually lead to deterring people from even exploring new ideas, right? Because if you start asking around or starting to talk to people about organizations or causes that you might want to support and really trying to do all that research, you start to expose yourself to this need to eventually say no if you decide, once you kind of reprioritize and figure out where you want to give. And so here's some more research that quantifies that piece I mentioned about the status quo, that part where we start to also really value the organizations that we know and are familiar with. So ready, another interesting experiment. So in this case, there were 3 different classes. In the first class, students were given this wonderful coffee mug and told that they could trade it for a chocolate bar. And in that case, 90% basically, almost all of them decided to keep the mug that they had. They chose the mug. But in another class, they gave them a chocolate bar first and said they could keep that, or if they wanted, they could trade it in for a mug. And in this case, when you frame it that way, it's exactly the opposite. 90% of the people choose to keep the chocolate bar. So, and then if you go to a sort of a neutral space where you just kind of ask the students up front, do you want a mug or do you want a chocolate bar? In that case, you get about a kind of a 50-50 split, which is kind of what you'd expect. So this just really shows that having something in our possession causes us to like it better and value it more. The phenomenon is called the endowment effect. Vicki will know that one already. But you can imagine this having sort of similar analogs in philanthropy, right? So we see organizations that we already know really well, and we see them as more valuable, and that can make it hard again to find and support the new opportunities that might exist in the space, even if maybe they are making a more of a difference or might be better aligned. All right, so this is our last poll of those 5. On a scale of 1 to 4, again, how strongly does this resonate with you? Serve up that poll. Here's the poll. All right, in the interest of time, I think I'm going to end it now. Get your votes in. I think this is interesting. This is the first one that we've gotten a little more of a shift, where 4 was not the biggest, the most popular answer, which is cool. This is really useful for us to hear this. Curious that folks weigh in. They have thoughts. And I know we're actually kind of short in time. Whoops, this has been so fun. I actually am going to keep moving then, given that. Okay, all right. So, all right, so these are to sum it up, here are the 5 barriers that we just talked about with you today. But based on the earlier polls, most of these resonate, maybe some of them more than others. Now I think we'd like to run our final poll and hear from you all and ask you which of these feels most important to solve. And we're going to give you 3 votes, so you don't have to just pick one. So we can serve up this final poll. So pick the 3 that for you feel most important to solve. And like you said earlier, this is really helpful for us and will help with our research too as we figure out where we want to focus. And thank you for all this feedback. That's great. The votes, all right. You seem to have slowed down a bit. Last call. Last 5 seconds. This is super interesting. All right. A few more coming in. All right, ending the polling now. All right. Okay. So the sort of choice paralysis, and that piece really resonated with folks. Setting a budget, personal relational way, and then the high volume of asks. Okay. A little bit less so. Value of pure connections maybe a little bit less important. Not to say that none of these are not important, but this is really helpful. Okay. So I know we only have 4 minutes left. Piyush, what do you want to do? Should we ask folks if we missed anything? Still want to do that?
Yeah, I think let's, yeah, we would love to hear from you if you think we've missed something. Now, these are, not comprehensive. We're continuing the research, of course, but since we have you all here, we'd love to hear is there something you felt, wow, it's weird they didn't talk about that? And you can chat it, you can call it out. Stephanie, go ahead. I see your hand raised.
Sorry, I've been talking, but I was thinking a lot about the relational effects and the peer influence piece, because we think about that a lot too. And I think in philanthropy in these last couple of years, we've been talking about proximity and the fact that, especially in the upper top of the pyramid, most of those wealth holders are people who aren't in proximity with community often because of how our communities have evolved and been designed, and policy effects and other things. And so, I always talk about that peer influence as a parent. It matters who the peer is. It can be positive or negative depending. And I think we really have to think about that carefully in philanthropy peer networks as well.
Yeah, no, that's definitely one of the features that makes it much harder to be unbiased. Right? Yeah.
I am seeing many more communities that are bringing movement leaders and community leaders into donor networks, which is interesting.
And Jeff, yeah, we did ask about information seeking, and it's really all over the place. But the one thing that came through is most people did not say they were using digital sources currently, right? Except for kind of the usual 990 verification type thing from a Charity Navigator or Candid.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, the giving platforms for sure. Yeah, absolutely. But ultimately, I think that's sort of the design work that we'll do. The behavioral challenge is getting people on those platforms in the first place, right? Currently, so many donors are just they already have their giving set. They kind of have a habit. They might have staff. They might have an advisor they like. So to change from that behavior is hard. And then others who've already tried and kind of become stuck, to activate them and get them on a platform. How do we do that? So those are exactly the type of design questions we'll be working on.
Piyush, I know we had talked a little bit about education and donor education in particular, and those on this Zoom call thinking that it's an important thing for us to educate, our members, our communities, et cetera, but that not necessarily being reflected by the members themselves, or at least in their actual usage of our services. Did you find that, or why did education not end up on the list?
Because here we were talking about possible barriers. So education will probably be in the solution set for sure, in different ways. But where it appears as a barrier, I think, is it's probably currently increasing the choice paralysis problem, because we have so many resources, and then many of the resources have a ton of jargon and complex information and complex concepts. So actually, behaviorally, what they will do is they will confirm that, oh man, I got to really learn more. I'm not ready. So if you start reading, it'll make you feel like, oh no, this is going to take me days, weeks, months. We had one story from one of our interviewees who literally, she was asked to take over her family foundation and went and got a whole master's degree in public policy so she could do it better. But she didn't want to do it before that. All right, well, we're a minute past. Thank you so much for all of these comments and questions. We will follow up with things that we didn't get to here. And let me, before anything, save the chat.
Yeah.
Whoops.
I think it saves in the recording, but.
Does it save in the recording? Yeah, okay.
Yeah. But just in case, go for it. Thank you, everyone.